yesterday brought up this little nugget. It's likely that one of Doug Pederson or Carson Wentz will return in 2021, but not both. Or in other words, who's your favorite kid? Nick's the only human that actually ever answers that question. Wentz has clearly regressed this season. I told you he'd answer it. It was supposed to be semi-rhetorical.
The others know it.
Wentz has regressed this season. Pederson might have lost this team. Thank God your family doesn't watch our show, Nick. Brian Westbrook joining us now. Brian, who's your favorite?
The middle child.
No, you know what? Don't answer that.
Well, she's the best.
Who should Eagles fans want on their team in 2021? Doug Pederson or Carson Wentz? Who should Eagles fans want?
Well, good morning, Jenna. And I love all of my kids the same. And so there's never any favorites here, only when it comes down to who brings me a dessert. So that's my number one kid there. But when you talk about the Eagles fan, I have to say this. If you're a fan of the Eagles, you have to want Carson Wentz to come back, fix Carson Wentz. And there's only one simple reason. In a year in 2021 where the overall salary cap will be decreasing, you can't afford to have $34 million of dead money on your cap if Carson Wentz is not there. You just can't afford to have that. And so in this scenario, you have to bring back Carson Wentz and you get rid of Doug Pederson. Here's what I would do if I'm the Eagles fan, though. I would be rooting for both Carson Wentz and Doug Pederson to come back, because this is what I know about Doug Pederson. In his 5 years being the Eagles head coach, he's won the NFC East 2 times. He's made the playoffs 3 times, and of course the Super Bowl. And this year, he's overcome more adversity. He's been fought with more adversity than any other coach in the NFL. Many of his games this season, he's played without 9 of his starters on offense. That means he's gone into games, multiple games, with only Jason Kelce, their center, and Carson Wentz, their quarterback, from their starting group at the beginning of the season. It's just hard to compete in this league with playing with that many backups. The other thing that Doug Pederson has simply overcome is a lack of talent on their roster. Think about this. In the last 4 seasons, they've had 28 draft picks, 28. Only 4 players out of those 28 players are quality starters for this football team. So when you combine the COVID, you combine a lot of the injuries, you combine the draft picks, now I have to say that Doug Pederson should have another opportunity to come back as a head coach. Here's a question that Jeffrey Lurie has to get answered, though. Can you fix Carson Wentz? And if you answer that question correctly, then at that point, I'm bringing back Doug Pederson and Carson Wentz in 2021.
Ooh, you said a lot there, B. A lot of validity behind what you said, but the real answer and the right answer is Doug Pederson. That's who you bring back. Doug Pederson already proved that he can get it done with another quarterback. This conversation is totally different if Carson Wentz was the quarterback that took you to the promised land, that got you that ring on your finger, but he didn't. So for that reason, you got to go with Doug Pederson. Doug Pederson hasn't made any big mistakes. Doug Pederson doesn't have any management issues. He understands how to deal with clock management. So what has he really done wrong? And you said it, B. Like those issues that they have on, on the defensive side and depth at the wide receiver, that's on Howie Roseman. That's who that's on. He doesn't control the roster. So when you look at this, if you're going to pick, you got to go with Doug Pederson, Nick, because when you look at the quarterback position, it's almost like marriage. It's complicated if you have too many things going on outside of marriage, man. Like that's just not right. Don't do it. So when you look at the quarterback position, you're married. Agreed. You're married to that person. That's right. You're married to that person. Yeah. So when you look at it, what happens if you bring both of those quarterbacks back? You got Jalen Hurts and you also got Carson Wentz sitting there. So let's say we go with Carson Wentz. Yeah. Carson Wentz throws one bad throw. He throws an interception. Everybody in Philly's going to be asking for Jalen.
Right. This is
correct.
Right. And so
it's Brandon, too messy.
This is so. I think Brian, as much as I adore him, I think Brian got 2 things dead wrong. The first one is Brian might not have a best child, but he certainly has a worst child. It's Brian Jr., who attacked the committee and attacked the team months ago, and it will not be forgotten.
Yeah, little Brian.
So little Brian is clearly bottom on the depth chart. That's first of all. Second of all is this. Carson Wentz is $34 million if he's on your roster next year or if you trade him. It's like an $800,000 savings if you trade him. So that money is spent. The question is, do you want a clean cap for 2022? Now, if Jalen Hurts just falls on his face and falls apart over the final 3 games, then sure, I guess you can bring Carson Wentz back. But at some point, you got to rip the Band-Aid off. Because if you bring Carson Wentz back for 2021, because you don't want $34 million of dead money, then just so everyone understands, then in 2022, the situation is, oh, it's $31 million if he's on your roster, and $25 million if you trade him, and $40 million if you cut him, and we're talking a little over a year from now. At some point, that bill is going to become due. And Brian, the question I would ask you is, what is the difference between it being $34 million of dead money or $34 million of backup quarterback money? To me, the only difference is at least it's a 1-year expenditure as opposed to keeping him there, and then you have to worry about it messing up your cap in future years.
Well, the big difference is pretty simple, Nick. The difference is that the only reason you bring Carson Wentz back is if you know that you can fix him. You're talking about the upside of a player that a couple years ago was considered an MVP candidate, that you think that Carson Wentz now can be the player that he was, and you feel that this year was a total aberration. If you think that you can fix him, then you bring him back. If you think he's a lost cause, then, of course, you take the hit on the salary cap and you allow Jalen Hurts to be your starter next season.
So the question I have for you is this, Nick. When we look at, like, reclamation projects, there was 2 big reclamation projects. Cam Newton came to New England for $1 million. Jameis went to New Orleans for $1 million. If you're running a team, and suppose I work for you, like, hey, buddy, I got a great reclamation project. I think I can figure it out. And you're like, who is it? I'm like, Carson Wentz. It only costs us $34 million, but maybe we get a pick out of it. Wouldn't you be like, huh? Like, no, I'm not into that.
So I would, if I'm trying to sell that, I would say, I've got a great reclamation project. He can be the next Ryan Tannehill, not the next Cam or the next Jameis. A guy who, you know, it showed minor flashes. Okay. Carson obviously showed more than Tannehill did in Miami, and then that can turn into a legitimate starting quarterback. And if I don't want to get too nerdy on the cap stuff. If he's traded, you're right. Tannehill was traded as a backup and then ended up starting. That's a good point. But if Carson Wentz is traded, the contract turns into $24 million a year over 4 years with the first 2 years guaranteed. That might sound like a ton, but right now the Colts, for instance, are paying, forget Phillip Rivers, Jacoby Brissett, $21 million of their cap. The Jags a year and a half ago signed up to pay Nick Foles $23 million a year. So I do think there will be a team that might have some interest in Wentz if the Eagles decide to make him available, which I think they should, and I think they will.